Welcome back everyone. This is Richard, candidate master from Sweden, and we're going to look at the third round of the Stockholm 1962 Interzonal tournament. So in the third round, Fischer is black against an Indian player, Manuel Aaron. Fischer started a bit slow with 2 draws, and we'll see what happened in this game. Manuel Aaron is one of the dominating players in India in the 1960s, also 9-time Indian champion, national champion of India. So let's have a look. Manuel plays d4 and Fischer plays knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. So again, Fischer goes for one of his favorite weapons as black, the Kingsindian defense. And the main line here is to play knight f3, but in this game Manuel chooses to play f3. This is also very popular. It's called the Samish variation and usually leads to sharp games with opposite side castling. So Fischer goes for short castle immediately, and white plays bishop e3, supports his center. Black plays knight bd7. e5 is the main line, but knight bd7 is solid, has been played by John Nunn on several occasions with good results. Black is preparing a pawn break in the center. He can either go for e5 or to play c5. And white plays queen d2. He has completed the queenside development and looks like he's going to go for a long castle here. So black plays c5, and the other break to play e5 instead. It's probably not that good because white hasn't made a short castle yet. So if you play e5, then white will immediately lock down the center with d5. He will castle long, and then the typical Kingsindian counterplay with f5 is not that strong because of the fact that the king is on the other side, and you will basically help white to open up the play on the king side. So also if you play e5, d5 and white castles long, it's not so easy for black to play c6 because the d6 pawn becomes very weak. So there's a lot of drawbacks. So it's quite preferable to play c5 here. White goes for knight ge2 and supports its center, and he's prepared to take back with a knight on d4 if black would exchange in the center. Black plays a6, interesting move, and a lot of players would probably choose to play b6 and then develop the bishop with perhaps bishop to b7. But the drawback is that the bishop is not that active on b7 because of the pawn chain g2, f3, e4. It would be biting in granite basically. So a6 is a move that limits white's choices a bit, because if he would castle long, then black would be able to play b5 very quickly and get good play on that side of the board. White goes for knight g3. I wouldn't call this move a mistake, but I think that white got a bit provoked by a6, and now he tries to speed up the kingside development and castle short quickly. But probably a better alternative to knight g3 would be to take on c5, and black takes back on c5 and then rook d1. Now you threaten to play bishop takes c5 because the queen is hanging on d8, and after queen c7 then you have the option of playing knight f4. So from this square, the knight can go to d5. So if black would play e6 to protect d5, you can also place the knight on d3, which would be probably a better setup than to play knight g3 immediately. So you have more choices if you just exchange on c5 immediately. Okay, so let's see, knight g3, and black decides to take on d4 because white gave away this option of taking back with a knight when he played knight g3. So he takes on d4 to take advantage of that. Bishop takes d4. Another move is queen takes d4, which is a really bad move because of the fact that black could play knight g4, attack the queen. Of course, it's very dangerous to put the queen on d4 when you have this bishop on g7, but let's see how you can exploit it immediately. So after knight g4, the bishop attacks the queen. He needs to fall back, and then you just take this bishop. So you don't really lose any material, but you lose the best piece in the position, this dark squared bishop that white had. And there is a big difference in the quality of the two white bishops, because the bishop on f1 is blocked by his own pawns. The pawn on c4, e4, f3, g2. So the bishop on e3, I would be very careful to exchange that bishop. I would like to keep it as long as possible in this position if I'm white. C takes d4, bishop takes d4, and black plays knight e5. He's not scared of getting double pawns after bishop takes e5. The only drawback is that if white takes on e5, d takes e5, the bishop on g7 gets temporarily blocked. But you would probably be able to maneuver a knight to d4. So you could play, maybe at some point you would play knight e7, rook e8, knight f8, knight e6, knight d4. And you have a really strong control over the dark squares in the position. So after knight e5, white decides to play bishop e2. Black plays bishop e6, finally getting this light squared bishop out and also pressuring c4. White decides to plant a knight in the center. This is a very good square for the knight on d5. And black plays an active move, b5. It's a powerful active move, and it seemed to have a drawback that it helps white's light squared bishop to get out. But the top priority for black is actually to break down the center, the white control of the center. And this c4 pawn is very important to stabilize the knight on d5. So white decides to take on b5, and this is probably a mistake, because he does liberate the bishop on e2, but at the same time his center control basically gets destroyed by this move. So a better move instead of c takes b5 is to just play b3 to protect the pawn on c4. If b takes c4, b takes c4, I think that rook c8 is my main line here, and then rook c1. Black gets some pressure on c4, but I think that white should be able to keep control of this c4 pawn, and he also have a very good grip of the center. If black at some point exchanges on d5, white would just take back with the c pawn. So this would be preferable, to just play b3 and keep the control in the center. C takes b5 was played in the game. A takes b5, bishop takes b5, and the most natural move is to play knight takes d5. That's also the move that Fischer decided to play. But the best move according to computer is actually to take with the bishop on d5, e takes d5, and now bishop h6. So the idea of this move is that the bishop on b5 is not protected, so it's a tactical way of exploiting that fact. Queen takes h6, queen a5 check, queen d2, queen takes b5. So here the problem for white is that the king is not castled. It's a bit out in the open. The d5 square is weak. Black has options of playing knight d3 check sometimes. So this would be quite dangerous for white to have this position. But if you take with a bishop on d5, you really need to see the follow-up. You need to find this move bishop h6 before you play it, and that's not an easy move to spot. So most players would probably take with a knight on d5 quite quickly, and this is what Fischer did. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop takes d5. So white center control has vanished totally, and now the pawn on a2 is attacked, so white decides to play a4, and black plays e6, protects the bishop in the center. It's always dangerous to have loose pieces that are not protected, so there will at some point there will be tactical opportunities if you leave your pieces unprotected. So e6 is a solid move. Short castle, and black plays queen h4. This move comes with a small tactical threat. If white is not careful, then black can play queen takes d4 check, and queen takes d4, and then knight takes f3 check, and the bishop takes back on d4, a discovered attack on the queen on d4. So white protects this bishop. He sees the threat, and black plays rook fc8. He's fighting for the open file, the c file. Bishop e3. Now white is posing a small threat himself of playing bishop g5, and the queen will be stranded on h4. It will be trapped. So after this move, bishop e3, is not that clear what black is doing with the queen on h4, because it's not really coordinating well with the rest of the black pieces. So probably a good move here is just to play queen d8 and find a better place for the queen and more secure place as well. Fischer decides to play knight c4, which also solves the problem, because he has a double attack on the queen on d2 and the bishop on e3, so white needs to take this knight, and now black can take back with the queen, so that solves the problem with the position of the queen. And white plays rook fc1, attacks the queen, queen a6, he falls back, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, knight c3. Fischer plays bishop to c4, so the queen is protecting the pawn on d6, so he's prepared to advance his center pawns now. White decides to play f4. This is not an accurate move. It does make it more difficult for black to advance his center pawns, but this move also comes with a lot of drawbacks, some serious drawbacks. It weakens the e4 square, so the white knight cannot use that square anymore. It also weakens the diagonal g2 to a8, and also reduces the scope of the bishop on e3. So this move doesn't make white's position any better. On the contrary, it probably makes his position worse. So after f4, black decides to play d5 to secure the light squares in the center, controls e4 and protects the bishop on c4. White plays bishop d4 and bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and queen b7 attacks the b2 pawn. So white decides to play queen f2, which is probably, it would have been better to protect the b2 pawn with a knight on d1, for example, because the queen is already well placed on d4, and after queen f2 it's been reduced to just protecting a pawn. Bishop a6, rook to d1, rook to c4, and now white plays rook to d2. This is a blunder, quite serious one, and a better option would be to play h3, because after rook d2 white doesn't realize that he has some serious problems on the back rank, and Fischer plays rook takes c3, which immediately decides the game. It's important that the bishop on a6 is controlling f1, so after b takes c3, queen b1 check, there is no way for white to defend the first rank, actually. So Fischer finally wins a game after 3 rounds, and if we try to find a lesson from this game, something we have learned, I would say probably that interesting moment when Fischer plays b5 and white decides to take it. I think white did that because he felt that it was important to improve his bishop on e2. But there's always conflicting ideas in chess, and it's important to try to figure out what is important in the position. And at that moment when Fischer played b5, the control of the center was the most important thing, but white didn't realize it. So he took on b5, and a couple of moves later he didn't have any center control at all, basically. And also the move f4 is an interesting decision. So when you make a move, you should always consider if there's any drawbacks, because the idea of f4 was to restrict the black center, but it also came with some serious drawbacks, as we saw. So I hope you enjoyed the game, and if you haven't subscribed yet, so please consider doing that. And if you have any questions, just write them and I will try to answer as good as I can. And hope to see you back for round 4. Thank you very much and goodbye.